Thank you, Wayne. Yes, appreciate the introduction. Thanks so much for the opportunity. Really, really humbled and honored. Um, I'm just a supply chain guy with a sourcing background, um, here to talk about regenerative agriculture, what General Mills is doing. So grateful to have the opportunity to work with the Soil Health Institute and a lot of the other partners on the phone today, and to work alongside producers, learn from them, work with them, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the insights that we've gained in the work in the last 4 or 5 years in soil health and regenerative agriculture, but also the evolution of General Mills' sustainability efforts over time. So my presentation here, I have a little bit of run a show with our responsibility as a food company, kind of the move from sustainability to regeneration, a little bit more detail around our commitment and our approach, how we're showing up with both some of our brands who have been leading in some of the communication, but also our supply chain activation and critical regions of sourcing for us. And then at the end, a little bit of insights from our work, personal insights probably, and an invitation to think a little bit differently about how we might work together. So here we go. So quickly, I added this slide because of just the global presence on the call. I wanted to make sure that folks were familiar with our brands. These are some of them. They're not all of them, but brands that you may have in your home. Certainly a global food organization, 100 countries, 100 different products, and really a responsibility as a large food company to do what's right for people, planet, and profit. And that really leads me to just one slide on consumer research, where the Hartman Group out of Bellevue, Washington, has showed here that really the main point on the right side of the slide, that consumers are shifting this responsibility to large companies from governments. There's a lot of detail here, but essentially the question was, who bears the most responsibility for making the world more sustainable? And this is not just about food. This is kind of all things sustainability, but it shows that some consumers see large food companies and large companies in general being part of the challenge or problem. So they require that, or they're pushing us to be part of the solution. And so that's a challenge for us. I think one of the other values that we look to is just General Mills has always done the right thing, and so we think this is the right thing not only for agriculture but for our business, and I'll talk more about that later. So we've been on a journey. I've been involved in our sustainability work really dating back to 2015. These are our commitments, and so you see a number of them here, some related to agriculture, some related to packaging. These commitments were announced a lot earlier than 2020. That's the first date you see here. And I'd say we've learned quite a bit over the last 10 years. And as for many on the phone, other CPGs, our work started in sustainability really in our own manufacturing facilities, but then expanded once we realized that so much of our impact and opportunity was upstream in agriculture. And so great work on our 2020 sourcing sustainability commitment that I've had the pleasure of leading. But then moving forward, really thinking about the next phase of our sustainability strategy. And so made a commitment in 2019 for regenerative agriculture on 1 million acres by 2030. And that's where I spend a lot of my time now, building strategies and building roadmaps for that essential work moving forward. So that's what I'm going to spend a lot of the time talking about today. And we're going to dig in right now. So the video while we were waiting to get started just did a great job just summarizing the opportunity, the challenges that we have. We would share a lot of similar messages. We know that there's lots of opportunities ahead of us. We think about those critical challenges, and we think about regenerative ag, and with soil health again as that foundation to really serve as a promising solution to a lot of these challenges we have ahead of us, or that are really here now as well. And so those are the principles I think there's pretty good alignment on. Like I mentioned, we made the General Mills commitment. And our approach, I would say, it can be summarized in two key elements. We want to accelerate farmer adoption, and I think we're figuring out ways that we can do that as a downstream food company, not really being experts in agriculture or in conservation, but what unique role can we play? And then we've always been focused on outcomes, and we've always been committed to science and research. And so again, having the pleasure to work with Soil Health Institute and others to quantify both environmental and economic impacts of soil health and regenerative agriculture. So those are the kind of two pillars of our approach, and I'll talk more about how those come to life at General Mills and out on the farmscape. Before we go there, just wanted to talk a little bit about our definition. I think when you talk about regenerative agriculture, it is a 9-syllable term. There's lots of different uses of it. And this is our definition. We think it's a holistic principles-based approach to farming and ranching that strengthens ecosystems and community resilience. The community resilience, the farmer profitability piece, we feel like is really important to elevate. I think that's sometimes been missing from the past. So how do we not only focus on restoring ecosystem function, rebuilding it with all those things you see here on the slide, but then also do we focus on profit? How do we make sure that we're considering yield, but how do we drive greater profitability, greater economic resilience for the producers and the stewards of the land? And so these 4 outcomes are the focused outcomes for General Mills, where again, we're going to be measuring impact, studying those outcomes over time. So soil health, biodiversity, water, farmer economic resilience. If we think about our newly launched regenerative dairy project in Michigan, we're also going to be studying animal well-being. And so again, a focus on outcomes to say regenerative agriculture is exciting. There's a lot of promise. It's being led by producers. How do we, just like the Soil Health Institute mentioned in the video, how do we document all these outcomes so that we can support those producers with economics, with some of those goals, the benchmarks, and so privileged to have a wonderful scientific team on staff at General Mills, so I don't have to work on the detailed measurement protocol. But this is where we're working, and this is core to a lot of our pilots. So speaking to the brand and regional activation, so we have a very large natural and organic business that many might be familiar with. And, I'd say the strategy of our brand activations is to advance regenerative agriculture by developing products, creating demand for ingredients that are grown using regenerative principles. And Annie's, Epic Provisions, Kernza and Cascadian Farm here are represented, where we've really tried to take a little bit of the lead with some of our smaller businesses, some with a little bit smaller supply chains, where we can do more direct sourcing, where we can have confidence to communicate something on pack, to drive greater awareness of what producers are doing, how they're leading and innovating, but also why it's important. And so we've that work in our national organic business has been a great learning laboratory for us as we think about some of our bigger brands at General Mills, where we'd have a similar opportunity to leverage our scale as a force for good. And how we're showing up is not necessarily with brand activations quite yet, but again, doing a lot of the research, the advancement in critical supply chains and sheds around the country to again support that adoption, or accelerate really that adoption of regenerative ag principle deployment on the landscape. So for our regional pilots, really the focus is to do that, what I just mentioned. And we have 3 that we've come out publicly with. One in the Northern Plains focused on our key oat sourcing region. However, we understand that oats are just part of the rotation. So the focus in that place is really about farms and whole farm systems. 45 farmers that are collectively managing 170,000 acres out there, and you see some of the brands represented in that work. In the Southern Plains, we think about Kansas and hopefully an expansion to Oklahoma here. 24 farms connected to wheat for our Pillsbury products. Again, 85,000 acres under management there. And then in Michigan, like I mentioned, with a focus on dairy, where soil health is just a component of how we want to study the whole system as we think about growing crops, to feed animals where they're milked, and then to manage manure, right? We know that there's about a third from an emission standpoint, and we know that dairies have really been stressed from an economic standpoint from quite some time. So how can we use soil health as a foundation for regenerative agriculture and regenerative approach for the entire dairy system? And so we're really excited about these pilots. This work has only been up online in earnest for the last year and a half, so we're learning quite a bit. And we have lots more work to do, but excited to be able to partner with producers, leading research organizations, and implementing partners to advance this critical work on the landscape. So digging a little bit deeper into those pilots, we have some key elements, and we really see technical assistance as being a critical component. We hear from so many producers that they go to a conference, they go to a field day, they're energized, they're revved up, and they're just not exactly too sure how to apply it on their operation, how to apply the principles, where to get started. And so we've made significant investments into training, education, but then one-on-one coaching for an extended period of time. I've committed to farmers for 3 years of one-on-one personalized coaching. So really see that technical assistance being key. We also want to approach this with not just technical systems, but look at this as a systems approach to solve systems level challenges. So how do we make sure that there's social support, cultural support, building community with these producers so that they can learn from each other, that farmers learn from other farmers, same thing with ranchers. How can we enable more of that cross-pollination, that sharing? Just some early insights in that work. The soil, wildlife, profit, water measurements, I mentioned those before, again, really focused on understanding and measuring impact. And then as we think about that profitability element and how do we incentivize producers, or how do we reward producers for where they are generating services for society? So pleased to share that we're piloting the protocols from the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium in our pilot in Kansas, and really excited to see what comes out of that. So we think about this as really creating this environment or this surround for producers to be successful in this significant amount of evolution and innovation that they're planning to go on. So it's a little bit more about our approach, about the pilots, about some of our brand activations, and to make sure that we have enough time for questions at the end. I just have one more slide here, and it's really to take some of the insights we've gathered over the last half decade, and more recently within the last couple of years with soil health and regenerative agriculture. We're starting to apply more of the concepts of regeneration to the way that we approach these projects, the way that we approach our business. And so I'd like to just invite others to think about these questions and how we might work together to advance this important work. And so the first one being just, how do we accelerate systems level research? I think that's where General Mills has kind of nestled into this role where we've been a research organization for quite some time, going back to the roots back in the 1860s. How can we play a role alongside leading researchers to maybe fund research that doesn't fit the typical experimental design? How can we look at systems level research so that we measure outcomes, but maybe are not necessarily able to say exactly what variable drove those outcomes? A challenge for us all to think about, if this is a living system in agriculture, soil health being a part of that, how do we make sure that our research answers the questions about those living systems? Or maybe doesn't even answer all the questions, just helps to quantify the impact of different management approaches on those impacts and outcomes that we talked about earlier. So a little bit of a challenge and invitation to think about research differently. And would acknowledge that many are already doing this, and so there's great folks on the line, I'm sure, that are already addressing systems level research. Similarly, if we're studying systems, if we're asking farmers to view their operation as an ecosystem, how do we more effectively as a team and a set of stakeholders and enablers, how do we more effectively team together to drive this progress? We all have unique roles that we can play, and I think there's been great examples of where there's kind of new collaborations forming that are taking the best that each organization can bring to the table. But how do we do that more in more places? How do we scale some of that approach to different differential partnerships? How do we more effectively team as thinking about our approach and regenerating our thinking? And lastly, I think this concept of moving from existence to potential, and a tricky one for me, I think, to wrap my head around, at least initially, but how do we move from trying to drive greater innovation and potential versus solving problems rooted in existence? Moving from how do we develop capabilities and capacities of collaborators involved in the project while advancing soil health and regenerative agriculture? How are we building the potential of all those involved versus, how do we just apply the resources that we have today with the problems that we've identified? How do we really unlock greater potential for the place, the producer, the ecosystem, the collaboration, the individual companies that are participating and investing together? How do we move from existence to potential? So those are just a few thoughts that I'd leave you with. We're, again, I would share, we're so grateful to work in this space. We see General Mills as a connector, an enabler of this important work. Just so appreciative of the innovation that's on the landscape, that's at the farm level, that's been there forever, the ability to come alongside those producers with leading companies like you all represent on the line, or we're happy to play a small role in this evolution. And thank you for listening.